Okay, we're back. Today we're talking about the decolonization efforts around the world, latter part of the 20th century, looking at India, Mohandas Gandhi, also known as Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, the Vietnam War, Frederick Spring, Alexander Dubček, Charles de Gaulle, disarmament, before the Cold War starting to wind down. Leonid Brezhnev, Mikhail Gorbachev, the two latter Soviet leaders, and Lech Walesa, according to democratic activist of Poland. Now, we start seeing here with the history of the 20th century is essentially you have one portion of humanity looking forward, looking to democratic solutions for problems, democratic solutions to for control of local communities and nations. Look forward to technology, science, and research to solve problems. And the other portion looking backwards, looking at use of force to try to control populations. Governments and factions desperate to try to control individuals, ideas, nations, things that were largely out of their control. But desperate to try to shape a world in a way that suited their own interests, rather than adapting to change. These totalitarian movements, no matter what kind of ideology they may frame themselves around, theocratic, fascist, communist, whatever else, essentially you see in each of these a refusal to accept the world the way it is. The world is changing. Most of the Western world is embracing that, attempting to move forward, accepting when scientific research and progress may change ideas, perspectives, versus the totalitarians who they try and encourage minds to grow, try to control them from growing. Actually, you'll see in the textbooks of these nations efforts to censor ideas, try to keep them from being mentioned altogether, or try to wrap and reorganize these ideas in ways that adopt a particular ideology. Look at Hitler and the Nazis. They were obsessed with ideas of racial purity, but there was science behind it. Ridiculous, laughed out of every other textbook in any other part of the world. The Soviets have tried to engineer historical facts and scientific facts to try to suit a communist agenda when they made no sense. In fact, they'd even tried to redraw maps to try to trick people into not escaping the Soviet Union. But as we saw through the beginning of this course, we saw the beginning of the age of colonization. European powers moving outward, conquering different lands, settling others. Often these lands had often been settled by someone else already, in case of having to forcibly push them out of the way, or convince these nations by force, by blackmail, whatever other means, to accept the fact that these powers were now in charge. And the colonial powers would fight over each other. These would pass resources. First in the New World, North and South America. In the late 1800s, we see it in East Asia, across Africa, for the big scramble continent. Now, up into the 20th century, nations conquered with armies. They conquered, held lands by force if necessary, using whatever means at their military disposal to crush any kind of resistance, try to shape and mold the ideas of the people to suit a colonial agenda. But with the end of the 20th century into the 21st, you see a shift. Recognition that use of force, that the idea that the strongest militarily should rule, using might for whatever ends they may see necessary, was largely counterproductive. But you cannot overpower someone's ideas. You only change their minds if they want to change them. So what starts happening more and more is cultural influences, cultural ideas spreading throughout the world. Take the European and American ideas. In fact, now there are several pictures in some textbooks of these anti-American rallies in areas of the Middle East today. But you'll see people in these protests wearing distinctively Western clothing. Not traditional clothing, those areas, but T-shirts, jeans. Sometimes I see little McDonald's logos on these T-shirts. So what's happening is, in the modern world, we don't conquer with armies anymore. We conquer with dollars. Nations are able to influence each other by trade, through money, through ideas, ideas that sell, images that sell. You say the carefree American lifestyle, prosperous American lifestyle. You say it's an image around the world that has attracted a lot of people. A lot of people try to embrace and copy it different ways. But there are limitations to that. Traditional ideas, other competing ideas, ideas clashing against each other. Probably see in the 21st century is you have very different ideas of what the world should be, clashing and fighting against one another. Sometimes quietly in the minds of individuals, behind the scenes, or very openly in terms of civil wars or riots and one faction trying to fight another power in some country somewhere. But we get back to the idea of the colonial empires. Remember, with Europe going out and really conquering the entire world, or just about all of it, it was these colonial powers, just a select few nations, a select handful of people, these nations, were calling the shots and developing the entire world. Sometimes bringing new ideas to these lands for the first time, new technologies, trying to organize a shift of these lands from their ancient traditional ways to modern, industrial, European, and Western ideologies and ways of living. So sometimes that didn't go well. But what you see, though, is increasingly was in the 19th, 20th century a symbiotic relationship between the colony and colonial power. Raw materials seemed to be produced in the colonial world, brought back to the colonial power, the mother country, where the raw materials were processed into all sorts of different products, and then the colonies themselves being seen as a market to sell those products. But clashes over different colonial policies had led to rebellions all across the colonial world at different times, different periods. Now, these colonies made Europe a ton of money. Like I said, Europe was able to rise to a standard of living never before seen in its history because of colonization. But they often did so at the expense of these colonial colonies that had no say in their futures or the direction of their communities. The American Revolution is probably an example of one of the largest anti-colonial efforts in world history. The colonies broke away from England over disputes over economic and legal policies of the British Empire. But some colonial powers rose, some colonial powers fell. Remember the rise of the British Empire. Like I said, the loss of the colonies, the United States, proved to be only a blip on the radar screen for the British. They expanded their efforts in Canada, expanded into Australia, New Zealand, across the Pacific, large portions of East Africa, and controlled India. Proved to be was called the crown jewel of the British Empire. You see, before World War I, Britain controlled a quarter of the globe. There's one person out of every four on Earth under British rule. Like I said, this had a tremendous effect of enriching Britain, expanding their influence around the globe. They were a great military power, a great economic power, and spread a lot of ideas about British life, Christianity, the English language being spread to the far corners of the globe. France, similarly, was a great colonial power. They controlled most of Western and Northern Africa, Southeast Asia, large number of islands in the Pacific as well as the Caribbean. So they've got these two great powers right here. Spain, for a long time, was a great colonial power that had largely faded from prominence when the 20th century began. Was controlling most of North and South America, all the way out to the Philippines, large islands in the Pacific. And so they lost pretty much all of it by 1900, except for a toehold in northern Africa. Portugal controlled Brazil, colonies in South Asia for a while, but again, by the 20th century they're pretty much reduced to a couple of areas in Africa. The Dutch, a simple little Holland, became a great colonial power, controlled Indonesia and other areas. Germany, portions of Africa, portions of the Pacific. Russia, mostly contiguous land, but after World War II, their conquest, their control of Eastern Europe essentially acted as a colony. Say Japan was also a great colonial power for a while, controlled Korea, large portions of China. They tried to expand it with World War II, but failed to do so. Like I said, the Japanese conquest of Korea, that still has a lingering effect on Korean society today. Not just the least of which was the division of Korea because of the Russian and American occupation after World War II. But while South Korea today is largely concerned with maintaining its foothold in the world economy as a rising industrial power, North Korea is always sending out propaganda in terms of anti-colonial, standing for anti-colonialism, even though they basically exist because of large amounts of aid from China. Otherwise, people would be starving to death. South Korea, it does not want Japan back in as a occupying power, China or the United States or anybody else. They want to be treated as a equal. They certainly don't want North Korea controlling them, but they realize that North Korea is so desperately poor and so starved that couldn't last long in a long fight against South Korea. But as we see, as these lands were taken over around the world, you had some who accepted it, some who did not. Some who may have been somewhat neutral or against it grew even more strident in their denunciations of foreign rule. If people wanted to live life on their own terms. So, the United States, having successfully broken away from Britain, in so many ways was admired by the colonial lands looking for independence. You find several documents in histories of some of these lands that try to model their own Declaration of Independence on the American one. But let's go to Africa. What's happening here? We say Africa, you see only the northern parts of Africa being controlled by the colonial powers up into the 1800s. Actually, it had different empires coming in and out. The Romans had controlled the northern coast of Africa for centuries. You have the Ottoman Turks in the 15th and 16th centuries. But as the Ottoman Turks were pushed aside, as the Europeans had come in time, the French in Algeria, this is here on page 896, and in Tunisia, the Italians in Libya, and the British in Egypt. Interestingly enough, with Egypt, you have this long-simmering resentment against British rule there. The British are mostly interested in Egypt because of its access to the Suez Canal, which is, of course, a tremendous shortcut between Britain and India. But because of Egyptian resistance to British rule, Egyptians gained independence in 1922. But interestingly,
how's it feel in here today?
all right. But because of the relationship between Egypt and Britain, Sudan was colonized. It was actually under joint British and Egyptian rule for several decades, really until Britain and Sudan gained its independence in 1956. They see an unusual situation sometimes with former colonies trying to become colonial powers themselves. You see, the United States, after the Spanish-American War, taking over the Philippines, attempt to dominate to the Caribbean region, so forth, has caused a lot of concern in the United States about the direction of American foreign policy. But there had been independence movements up in the early 20th century, before World War I and after World War I. Woodrow Wilson, in his 14 points, had called for decolonization. But the European powers, though, making so much money off these colonies, they don't want to give up these colonies yet. They don't want to give up the cash cow. So after World War I, the Europeans actually increase and expand their colonial holdings. Germany's great colonial holdings were divvied up among the Allies. What had been Ottoman territory in the Middle East was divided up between the British and the French. But World War I put a strain on the military and financial power of Europe. And it only accelerated after World War II. France and Britain were basically bankrupt, After 1945, they're basically trying to put their colonial empires back in order and basically trying to move on like nothing had happened. But something very significant had happened. The world had changed. And the colonial powers could no longer resist these changes or try to suppress these changes by force of arms anymore. So between 1947 and 1962, because of the collapse of the European political system, because of what happened in World War II, nearly every colony around the world will gain independence. For example, the United States, they gave the Philippines its independence on July 4th, 1946. So that Philippines is without the same Independence Day. But this had been planned years before World War II. It was disrupted because of the Japanese occupation of the Philippines. The United States had to go in, throw out the Japanese, and then try to repair the damage been done in the Philippines for giving the Filipinos their independence. It's a planned character takeover after the war. And then India. Because of the effort of this man, Mohandas K. Gandhi, called Mahatma Gandhi, which means in their language a great soul, a great spirit. He was a lawyer. He had worked in South Africa for a while. He experienced the racial prejudice of the British system and returned to India in an effort to try to end the British rule there. So you got to remember about England is it's a class-based society. It really is that on up into the mid-20th century. There's a certain hierarchy of the world and certain people fit into it. You have to be born in certain classes. Along with that, there's a lot of racial prejudice as well. You don't have so much in England itself because you don't have a lot of racial minorities living in England. But it is there. There's a hatred of the Irish and a lot of English didn't feel superior to the Scots and the Welsh, which are still causing the problems to this day. But in the colonies themselves, even though you may have had some natives who were living in those areas that were fairly well-to-do, a lot of cases you had instances of segregation. You had instances where the natives were inferior, second class under British law, and it fed a lot of resentment. Well, Gandhi created a movement to try to drive the British out of India. And essentially it was a policy of passive resistance. See, Gandhi was a pacifist, believed that war and violence were immoral, and that if India was going to be free, it couldn't do so by waging war and overpowering the British. It had to do so by basically making life as difficult for the British as possible without resorting to violence. They called for this through peaceful demonstrations, boycotts of British products, essentially just trying to make the economic advantage the British had with occupation of India untenable, make Britain unprofitable. Essentially, whatever they do, don't fight back. And there were instances in which the British did try to disrupt demonstrations, beating protesters, shooting some of them, but the Indians never fought back. Simply persisted and redoubled their efforts. In fact, by the eve of World War II, there was some talk of granting India some autonomy, but with World War II, Britain suddenly needed India's resources more than ever. And Gandhi pressed his advantage with the war. So Gandhi Like I said, he was a pacifist. He didn't want Hitler to win, or recognize it was a great evil, but recognize, though, there were limitations to passive resistance. American reporter once asked Gandhi, said, can you defeat a man like Hitler with peaceful resistance? Gandhi replied, not without great loss. It could be done, there would be great losses in the process. Gandhi was also asked what he thought of Western civilization. Gandhi said he thought it was a nice idea. But during World War II, Gandhi also organized a lot of strikes and boycotts of British products and the companies during the war in order to try to maximize the pressure on the British politically, to make sure the British realize that they are going to have to make a deal with India. They're going to have to grant it its independence. In fact, during World War II, Gandhi often sponsors several campaigns called the Quit Britain Now campaigns. Basically, if Britain had given its demands that then they would have, and Britain and India would seek its independence immediately. But while passive resistance was extraordinarily successful, and the British agreed to transition after the war, there were serious problems in India itself. See, British India wasn't just India. It was also you also have Pakistan, and what they call at that time East Pakistan. You see, while India is majority majority Hindu, more than 1 billion Hindus, it also has a very large Muslim minority. In fact, you went to the extreme ends of India, the east and the west. Those areas were Muslim majority, but they were on opposite sides of the country. And Hindus and Muslims scattered in between. Now, there have been a lot of traditional antagonisms between the two, but the British basically, through their force of the military, they kept that suppressed. That division still exists in the minds of the people. In fact, even India had a problem because Hinduism had this deep caste system. Certain people, certain families are assigned in certain social classes and certain jobs. But the biggest problem they were facing, though, was the Hindu-Muslim divide. And both sides, both Hindus and Muslims, saw themselves not as Indians first, but either as Hindus or Muslims. So while Gandhi had pushed for a united Indian state of Hindus and Muslims living together peacefully, not everyone was quite as accepting as he was. So as a result, in 1947, India is given independence. India as a Hindu majority nation, and Pakistan, East Pakistan, as one Muslim majority country, all Pakistan. The problem was, though, the Kashmir province. So northwestern India, or on the northeast Pakistani border, what was West Pakistan. It was assigned to India, but it had a Muslim majority. And because of that, though, India said this area should be theirs, Pakistan said it should be theirs, and as a result, there were 3 wars fought over Kashmir starting in 1948 into the 1970s. The situation even worse was by the 1990s, you still have those tensions of Kashmir, but India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. Now, Pakistan had its own problems because it's these countries on two separate sides of India. Well, after a coup in 1971, East Pakistan sought its independence as Bangladesh. It's been independent ever since. Geography, economics, and demographics simply made the idea of East Pakistan as united with West Pakistan simply is an untenable and unviable idea. So Pakistan eventually just let Bangladesh go on their own, be independent. Britain accelerates the decolonization process. 1948, independence is given to Ceylon, to Sri Lanka, that large island just off the coast of India, called Sri Lanka, and Burma. 1949, the Dutch were unable to regain control of the East Indies after independence activists there had formed their own independent government after World War II. So the Dutch East Indies become independent as Indonesia. And then you have the problem in Southeast Asia. The area of Indochina. The French had come in and colonized this area in the late 1800s, the southeastern corner of Asia. And in 1941, because the French were occupied by the Germans, France demanded that the Vichy public government turn over control of Indochina to Japan. They did so. And so as a result, in 1941, 1945, people of Indochina were fighting against Japan. They had this long simmering resentment against the French, but now it's also against Japan. In fact, you have people of Indochina receiving Lend-Lease aid from the United States. And a lot of this movement against the Japanese was led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist who was educated in France. People in the region were drawn to him for his leadership and his leadership skills and tenacity against the Japanese. So after 1945, France tries to move back in and try to reassert control over Indochina. Well, the people of Indochina aren't going to have it. Didn't like Japan, but they don't like France either, so they try to get rid of them. So from about 1945 to 1954, it became called the Viet Minh movement. But this long war by the people of Indochina to try to force the French out of there. And the French are pouring thousands of troops in there, thousands of casualties back and forth, trying to retake control of this colony. The French begged for British and American aid. The Americans refused to give any kind of direct military aid, but President Harry Truman in the 1950s is giving $10 million in aid to the French to maintain this colony. But Truman did it because of the containment policy. The French were able to say, we're fighting a communist insurgency led by this man, Ho Chi Minh. So Truman gives money to put down this communist movement. In late 1953, the French are still struggling and asked for help from President Dwight D. Eisenhower to send American military aid to assist France. Eisenhower declines to do so because he fears that, one, this is a more colonial effort in anything, and second, that, in his words, that division after division be swallowed up by the jungles of Southeast Asia. Well, you have the fall, this French fortress in northern Vietnam, what is now Vietnam. It's under siege for months by Viet Minh forces. By May 1954, they're supposed to surrender. All of those forces called the Dien Bien Phu. 1954. And so the sides go to Geneva, Switzerland, to try to negotiate an agreement. And so Indochina is given its independence, broken up into the countries of Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam, South Vietnam. Again, the two be divided at the 19th parallel, degrees north latitude. North Vietnam was controlled by the city of Hanoi and controlled by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam, ruled out of Saigon, was nominally a republic, or at least anti-communist. Like I said, neither North Vietnam nor South Vietnam had very strong human rights records. Human rights were not a priority at all. In fact, there are several native tribes in North Vietnam that the North Vietnamese brutalized. South Vietnam, there was essentially no freedom of speech. You were basically, the government would arrest you, beat you, and brutalize you because they didn't like what you had to say. Reunification elections for the two Vietnams scheduled for 1956, but the Eisenhower administration realizes because Ho Chi Minh was so popular by defeating the French and the Japanese that he'd win this re-election easily, this unification election easily. See, in Vietnam, he seems kind of a George Washington-like figure. So Eisenhower pushes for South Vietnam to remain independent, and so North Vietnam starts the Viet Cong movement to destabilize the government of South Vietnam and to fight for a forcible reunification of two Vietnams. Of course, South Vietnam didn't need a lot of help being destabilized. It was already doing that on its own. In 1957, Eisenhower sent military advisors, basically sending American troops to Vietnam to actively train the South Vietnamese army to fight the Viet Cong. To make the situation even worse, in the late 1950s, the South Vietnamese government is rounding up civilians and placing them in camps, basically imprisoning them so they can monitor them. And they're taking young men out of these camps at military age and forcing them into the South Vietnamese army. A lot of protests against the South Vietnamese government. When John F. Kennedy becomes president in 1961, he continues Eisenhower's advisor policy, even ups the ante, sending thousands more, actually sending some of these advisors on missions with Vietnamese troops to see how they're performing in combat. So, by 1963, the elected government of South Vietnam was overthrown in the coup. So the military had taken over, and as a result, what little legitimacy the South Vietnamese government had was taken away because they're now under a military dictatorship. The situation destabilizes rapidly. And so you have a phase of the war with Mexico. Between 1964 and 73, in which the United States would be fighting against the Vietnamese, North Vietnam, to try to keep South Vietnam independent. The United States, this period is called the Vietnam War. The Vietnamese call it the American War. But essentially, after North Vietnamese gunboats allegedly attacked an American destroyer in the Gulf of Tonkin just off the coast of North Vietnam. And President Lyndon Johnson had taken over after Kennedy's assassination, pushed through Congress something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave the U.S. government, gave the Johnson administration authority to protect American interests in Vietnam, do whatever, giving the military whatever action, whatever power it needed to defend from any type of insurgency or attacks on American positions. This meant that more troops be sent in, they'd be sent on reconnaissance missions, and also included bombardments in North Vietnam. So hundreds of thousands of American troops go into Vietnam, are actively fighting, active bombing in North Vietnam. By 1968, there are 500,000 American troops fighting in Vietnam. Now, see, here's the thing about this whole thing. It's the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army didn't have the strength to take on the American forces directly. In fact, the United States never lost a major military engagement in Vietnam. We took very heavy casualties, but we never lost a major battle. The problem was Viet Cong forces kept coming, month after month, year after year, inflicting heavy casualties, wearing down morale of troops, and wearing down the morale of the American public. We're seeing all these images being broadcast on TV. Basically, the war being brought into their living rooms for the first time, the first televised war. In 1968, Viet Cong upped the ante by launching what they call the Tet Offensive. After American defense officials had assured the American public that the Vietnamese were, North Vietnam was finished and the war would be over soon, the Viet Cong launched this massive attack into the large cities in South Vietnam. American forces repelled these attacks, came with heavy casualties, but it was a major setback for the Viet Cong, but it was a public relations victory for them. To the world, they seem to show that they have all the strength that they could launch attacks on all these cities, undermining the American public's belief in their own Defense Department officials, saying that the war was almost over. Well, peace talks began in 1968. Richard Nixon is elected president partly on his promise that he could end the war, bring what he called peace with honor, and probably had a secret plan to end the war, but instead Nixon expanded the war and it went on for another 4 years. Nixon attempted a policy called Vietnamization, basically trying to bring more South Vietnamese troops into battle, making them more directly responsible for fighting, but it proved to be disastrous because South Vietnamese didn't want to fight for their government. So they're being arrested, they're being tortured and beaten. What point was there? Well, their own votes didn't count because the military is overthrowing their government. They didn't feel any strong need to fight. They had no vested interest in it. In the meantime, even though North Vietnam was taking very heavy casualties, you had a lot of young men coming of fighting age wanting to fight to oust the Americans and reunify the two Vietnams. Nixon had promised to end the war in Vietnam. I say he greatly expands it. In 1970, it was the illegal invasion of Cambodia. Nixon was convinced that for the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that Viet Cong insurgents were being fed men supplies into South Vietnam through Cambodia, so Nixon, without approval from Congress, invades a neutral country and starts bombing it. The bombing of Cambodia destabilized it, leading to civil war, which led to the ouster of its own government. Cambodia had been a very peaceful kingdom led by Prince Norodom Sihanouk, but he is thrown out of power by the military. And so this extremist group called the Khmer Rouge rises up and threatening to and pushes to oust the military taking over Cambodia. And to do so by 1975. What happened was Khmer Khmer Rouge are the extremist communists. They wanted to basically undo all Western influences in Cambodia. Basically set the clock back to what they called year zero and start over society in a communist image. So they emptied all the cities, put everyone to work on these large farms, basically slave labor, and trying to basically rebuild civilization in its own image. Families are broken apart. People are starved to death, beaten, brutalized, murdered. Anyone with any connection to the old regime, the military, politicians, anyone with any kind of education, businessmen, students, people who just wore eyeglasses, because the sign was a sign were educated, all murdered. Out of a country of 10 million people, Cambodia, 2 million people were killed. 20% of the population. So many dead they couldn't bury all the dead. They couldn't even identify all the bodies. And they ruled Cambodia for 3 years, until Vietnam, now reunified under communist rule, comes in and ousts the Khmer Rouge from power. Khmer Rouge did not finally defeat until the 1990s. 1971, Nixon orders the invasion of Laos, just to the north of Cambodia. Same reason for the invasion of Cambodia. Try to thwart the Viet Cong, but again involved bombing and attacking a neutral country. Laos did not have was not destabilized like Cambodia, but heavy casualties were found in that country. Back when Nixon was threatening to impeach Nixon over Watergate in 1974, the invasion of Cambodia, they were debating making one of the charges of impeachment against him. Well, in 1973, after months of negotiations, years of negotiations, a ceasefire agreement was signed in Paris, and American troops agreed to withdraw from Vietnam, South Vietnam. Ceasefires were running between North and South Vietnam. So, when American troops left in South Vietnam in 1973, you had 57,000 U.S. dead, more than 2.2 million Vietnamese dead. The U.S. had fought to maintain the independence of South Vietnam as a backcountry civilian government, a very weak civilian government. And they left in 1973 with South Vietnam independent. But the threat from North Korea still loomed against South Vietnam. The threat from North Vietnam still loomed against South Vietnam. Essentially, it was a stalemate. But it's so divided American society, U.S. suffered so many heavy casualties that it felt like a loss. Technically, it was just a stalemate. In 1975, North Vietnam attacked South Vietnam and conquers it in a matter of weeks. Now, one example of the disaster of this era, the attempt to try to sort through these old lingering rivalries in countries, trying to fix the political situation. Under colonization, there's an occupation in some of these countries. The political and social order is twisted and deranged. And it takes years afterward to try to sort it out, these countries and these populations try to figure out just realizing what had happened to them and how they try to move forward as independent peoples. We see efforts of this in the Middle East. 1947, as the British prepared to leave Palestine, the United Nations voted to create both Arab and Jewish states in Palestine. But just as soon as the British left in 1948, the Arab powers in the Middle East decided all to declare war on Israel to try to wipe it out, deciding they wanted every last scrap of land in the Middle East. This led to 4 wars and innumerable terrorist incidents, but every time these Arab armies attacked Israel, Israel won and got stronger. Africa, we see a real mix of different decolonization efforts. Some countries it is done peacefully. Some cases it's long drawn-out wars. For example, here with France. 1956, starting with this first big wave of independence movements in India. France gives independence to Morocco and Tunisia. It's followed by Ghana in 1957. You can see on the map, I've read 896. It's some areas you have it's long, drawn-out independence conflicts. Others you don't. Sometimes it's done fairly quickly. So sometimes it's done just very quickly. And we'll take Libya, for example. Libya had been taken over by Italy early in the 20th century. It was lost in World War II. Italy tried to expand its control in Africa, tried to take in Ethiopia, but they're thrust out by the British, and British and the Allies forced the Italians and the Germans both out by 1943. And so between 1943 and 1951, Libya is under a joint Allied occupation. So it's given its independence in 1951 from joint United Nations control. A monarchy is established in Libya, which would last until it's overthrown by the military led by Muammar Gaddafi in 1969. Now, France, take the instance of Algeria. And say sometimes you had these countries. These countries wanted to let go, that said that the military occupation wasn't necessary for them to turn a profit there, that various different reasons decided it's okay to let these countries go peacefully on their own. But Algeria is a little different from France. They saw Algeria basically as a part of France, which is, we see Alaska as part of the United States. It seemed just naturally part of it. But the difference here is Algeria is very different. Algeria became under French control in 1830. The majority of the people of Algeria did not have rights to vote in French elections. They are mostly Muslims against France that is majority Roman Catholic. But there are 2 million French citizens living in Algeria. And the Algeria nationalists, led by the National Liberation Front, launched a series of attacks on French positions in 1954, launching a violent, brutal war of independence. Like I say, this lasts for years. Thousands of casualties, France pouring troops into Algeria to try to put down the rebellion. But the government realizes they can't win, so in 1962, after this long war, Algeria is granted independence. Now, this causes a lot of problems for Charles de Gaulle, the president of France. He'd been the big war hero, the man who basically led the Free French forces during World War II, led France's liberation from Germany, and led the peace afterward. 1960, the Belgian Congo was granted independence as Zaire. Because of a series of civil wars and everything, eventually changed the name back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. About the 1990s. 1960, French West Africa has given its independence. It's a whole slew of countries being given their independence now have been broken. Now, for administrative purposes, it's administered to several different areas, but it's commonly all just called French West Africa. So, countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad, all given their independence. Also, French Equatorial Africa has given its independence. Again, pretty much the same thing. And all this just for Algeria's given its independence. Starting to see the writing on the wall, but Central African Republic, like say Nigeria, Benin, other nations across near the equator, controlled by the French, all given their independence. Congo, Gabon. Somalia, which had been in Italian territory, they're allowed to retain that colony. They're given their independence in 1960. But also the British start giving up their empire in East Africa. 1961, Tanzania was given its independence. 1963, Kenya was given its independence, but that was after a series of very violent uprisings in the country. 1964, Zambia, Malawi, here in South Central Africa, given their independence. 1966, Botswana has given its independence from Britain. So at that point, after about the mid-1960s, things kind of slowed down for them. Most of Africa has been given its independence by this point. Ethiopia and Liberia had been independent for a long time. But you've got some very serious problems in Africa, some of the worst in the world. Most of these nations are beset by problems of extreme poverty, the worst in the world. And some of the problems date back to colonization. That is, when these colonial powers came in, they drew up these administrative boundaries that weren't based on any kind of traditional boundaries, make any kind of political sense for these countries. Basically, just for geographic convenience for the colonial powers. So you have these long-standing problems between tribal groups and ethnic groups. They will divide clan and unclan, tribe among tribe, ethnic group among ethnic group. Because you have to remember something about Africa is it's not all just one group of people. Very different groups, very different languages, traditions, social structures, different ethnicities. I say, just as Europeans aren't all one ethnic group, Africans aren't all one ethnic group either. But the colonial powers have exacerbated these tensions because of the divisional lines. Sometimes you see this sometimes in Europe as well. That they take one tribe, clan, ethnic group and use it to suppress another, using his old rivalries to try to maintain control, divide and conquer. And these territorial divisions, like they might have splitting of one group right into two or even three pieces. Or they may have traditionally ruled an area, but because they're so divided by these European political divisions, all of a sudden they find themselves in a small minority. And so as a result, once the European powers left, some of these groups rose up to try to settle old scores or try to put themselves in power. And so this long drawn out bitter wars, civil war started. In fact, some of these countries have been in a constant state of civil war since independence. So whatever progress they had in terms of infrastructure or building up the early independence period and even the colonial period was wiped out. And one thing you also have to understand, though, is a colonial army may leave, but the businesses don't. These colonial armies have maintained their rule through 40 or so many years, but the individuals, the businessmen, merchants, and so forth, they've had a careful relationship with the local populations and kept those relationships intact for business purposes. But many of these countries still have very active business interests in these former colonies. Which is why sometimes you might hear about some attempted coup in some little country in Africa. And so why is the French army sending in its army to, say, Mali or Nigeria or someplace like that? Because they have business interests and citizens still in those areas. So sometimes these former occupying powers coming in to basically sort things out, try to convince one military group to give up fighting or allow free elections. Situations like that. 1975, Mozambique is given its independence from Britain. In Zimbabwe by 1980. Zimbabwe had been a very prosperous colony. It had a lot of Europeans living in Zimbabwe, living prosperously as farmers and businessmen. But had a horrible problem here. When it became independent, the president was a man named Robert Mugabe. Power-craving, corrupt man, bent on destroying his enemies. Since 1980, it's been one-party rule in Zimbabwe, ruled by Robert Mugabe, who has done everything he could to oust the white farmers, taking their lands, impoverish his political opponents, try to enrich those few who are keeping him in power, so much to the point that Zimbabwe's economy has completely collapsed. Today, they are one of the poorest nations in Africa. They can barely feed their own population, extraordinarily corrupt, and their money is completely worthless. Because of 36 years of rule by Robert Mugabe. Portugal loses its last colony at Portuguese Angola after a long, bitter civil war in 1975. South Africa, actually, had been independent normally for a very long time, but the problem was the population had been majority black population, like whatever their clan or ethnic entity, was kept at a second-class level for so long. It had a process of segregation, which the white South African government called apartheid. This man, Nelson Mandela, fighting for years through speeches, diplomacy, and telling people to fight back wherever they could to fight against apartheid. Essentially, Mandela and others determined they would not be slaves in their own land. Well, Mandela was arrested in charge of treason in 1964 and spent in prison for decades. His release became an international cause, and especially as the world more and more condemned the apartheid system in South Africa, Mandela became a symbol of ending that. With by 1990, 1991, pressure mounted to the point that Mandela was able to be released from prison. He gave a rousing speech seen around the world on TV that calling for peace, calling for unification, but also calling for the rights and liberties of the majority of people in South Africa. Within just a couple of years after that release, the minority white government in South Africa allowed for the black majority to vote in elections, bringing in a new multiracial government, which has ruled South Africa ever since. Mandela was the first president of this new South Africa. But let's go ahead and take a look here what's happening back in Europe. Again, Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, Soviet control of Eastern Europe, communist bloc, in so many ways was reminiscent of colonial actions by the British, by the French, by others across the world. What we start seeing by the early 1950s, though, is Soviet growth is slowing. Industrial growth, which had been about 13% by 1953, had now slowed to about 7.5% by 1964. Khrushchev, remember, Nikita Khrushchev, taking over control of the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin. But Khrushchev was recognizing by the early 1960s serious problems in the Soviet system. The slow growth of their economy was causing a lot of hardships for the people, and also there was increasing amounts of corruption in the Soviet government. So, his attempt to try to curb corruption among party officials ended up leading to Communist Party members kicking him out. Thrust out of power, basically. He went on vacation in 1964. And his successor, a man named Leonid Brezhnev, engineered his dismissal while he was away. It's probably in his staff meetings. So after his 11 years in power, he's thrust out and basically just lives the rest of his life as a private citizen. Brezhnev had once been a supporter of Khrushchev, but that engineered the downfall. He emerged as the new leader of the Soviet Union, with a ruling an iron fist until his death in 1982. But what we had seen in Eastern Europe between 1940 and 1953 was essentially Stalinization, trying to communize and industrialize all these countries of Eastern Europe, brutalizing the populations if necessary. And we see this here with different efforts. Yugoslavia, for example, Marshal Tito taking control there, had declared Yugoslavia to be a Marxist-Leninist state, not a Stalinist state, and had to try to decentralize an economic and political system, allowing the workers to manage themselves. Tito had managed to basically keep the ethnic divisions in Yugoslavia in check, but it was still a communist state. 1956, you see another series of uprisings in Poland. Workers' protests erupted over communist rule. The communist leader there had tried to seek a series of reforms and declared that Poland had the right to follow its own socialist path. Well, as a result of this, the Soviets sent in the Red Army and crushed the uprisings, removing their first secretary from power, putting a hardline government in its place. 1956 in Hungary, you see a man named Imre Nagy. Hungarians had risen up and declared Nagy as a communist leader. Nagy had promised reforms. He was a very popular figure. A lot of economic problems in Hungary in the 1950s. The secret police were hated. And so Nagy became a symbol of this new openness in the in the communist system in Hungary. People were following him. And the people were blaming the Soviet Union for it. So Nagy declared Hungary to be a free nation on November 1st, 1956, and promised free elections for people of Hungary. What ended up happening was, November 4th, the Red Army attacked Hungary, kicked out Nagy, who would end up dying in prison some years later. And Nagy is replaced by the Soviets by Janos Kadar. He'd rule from 1956 to his death in 1988. Hardline communists cooperated with the Soviets. He observed a few reforms, basically trying to make life as miserable as possible for his people to try to protect his own rule. But the death of Nagy, so the uprising in Poland, uprisings in Hungary, provoked a lot of concerns among the West, particularly the United States. But it wasn't a lot the United States could do about it because this was well within Soviet territory. Plus the fact that the President of the United States at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, suffered a heart attack and was not able to do much of anything at that point. But what you see across Eastern Europe, though, is an effort trying to free themselves from Soviet rule, free themselves from communism, and just open up to a lot of their countries to be ruled by their own people in a democratic manner. So you get to Prague Spring. Well, Prague Spring opens the story of a man named Antonin Novotny. Novotny was a Stalinist. He had alienated many of his own party. He had controlled Czechoslovakia. And he had resisted the dissidents rising up. See, in every one of these countries, you see some kind of effort to resist Soviet rule. Some more successful than others. And the resistance in Czechoslovakia was very outspoken. Basically, it's a group of playwrights, poets, writers, and professors led by a man named Václav Havel. Wrote a series of plays and articles condemning the communist rule in the Czechoslovakia. Havel's a popular writer, known for a very wicked sense of humor. A very sharp man as well. Well, things weren't going well in Czechoslovakia. The economy was stalled out. The people were oppressed. Novotny was a hated figure. So in 1967, Havel led something called the Writers' Rebellion. And through their writings, these writers basically encouraged people to rise up and demand the resignation of Novotny. People did so. Novotny resigns and is replaced in January 1968 by this Alexander Dubček. Dubček was named first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. A reformer, very popular figure. Agreed to a lot of the elements of the Writers' Rebellion. The people were very happy with him. Dubček called for free press, freedom of speech, freedom to travel abroad, travel anywhere they wanted without these severe restrictions that placed on the people's movements. Relaxation of the secret police. And it led to this euphoria. All of a sudden, these new freedoms, Dubček agreed to it. People are celebrating the streets, they're happy, and they call Prague Spring. Maybe they might be able to start breaking away from Soviet rule and start kind of calling their own shots, becoming a more democratic state. People live their lives on their own terms. But Brezhnev couldn't stand the idea of Czechoslovakia breaking away. So in August 1968, the Red Army invaded Czechoslovakia. Dubček was arrested. Another name, Gustav Husek, was appointed and dismantled all his reforms. Paul and others were placed in prison or in and out of prison for the next several years. So this one attempt by Czechoslovakia to break away ends in disaster. Now, for Central and Western Europe, 1950 industrial output is now 30% of the pre-war levels. So with the 1950s, with the Marshall Plan and everything in effect, Europe had recovered. So, start seeing changes in some of these different countries, particularly, example, France. Charles de Gaulle becomes president, what came to be called the Fourth Republic. France establishes a new constitution. It's time women can vote. Women were attempts to try to give women the right to vote in France in 1919 failed. Women don't actually get the right to vote until 1945 in France. So the Fourth Republic, the new constitution is established. Lasts from 1945 to about 1958. And as a parliamentary system, Charles de Gaulle considered the parliamentary system weak. It was root in politics, but still a widely respected figure. People always coming to him for advice and statements, trying to get him back in politics. But France has suffered a number of defeats abroad, Indochina, the Algeria crisis, and you have the strong anti-war movement rising in France, pushed by the church and by intellectuals, and deeply divided France, and sent to the point that France could no longer really govern itself. So French leaders allowed de Gaulle to come in and reform the government to prevent a civil war in France, a total breakdown of order. The result was the creation of the Fifth Republic. The new constitution established in 1958, left ever since, one of the more long-lasting of the French republics, with Charles de Gaulle as president, who ruled until 1968. Well, the Fifth Republic increased the powers of the president. The president had the right to choose the prime minister, dissolve parliament, and to supervise defense and foreign policy. De Gaulle increased France's role in the world, withdrew France from NATO high command briefly. There would be an initial return, though. Like I said, France, de Gaulle wasn't trying to move against NATO or Russia. Basically, just wanted to kind of show France's independence and just de Gaulle's ego basically kind of getting in the way. De Gaulle agreed to Algerian independence in 1962. France increases its prestige in the Third World by trying to help these former colonies and emerging nations modernize and develop prosperity. De Gaulle developed the French atomic bomb in 1960. He did not use it in Algeria, of course, but essentially trying to show that France was a significant power on its own. Between 1958 and 1968, de Gaulle's presidency, French economy expanded by an average of 5.5% per year, except increasingly large deficits by the 1960s. But May 1968, you see a series of strikes led by students and union workers led to de Gaulle's resignation by April 1969. De Gaulle died in 1970. West Germany, prosperity, moving, rebuilding the country very well. Their army would only allow them to fight for defensive purposes, but they did join NATO, again, as a defensive alliance. By 1955, West German gross national product exceeded all pre-war Germany. Real wages for West Germans doubled between 1950 and 1965. Unemployment was practically non-existent in Germany by 1965. West Germany began making payments to Holocaust survivors and Israel for restitution by 1953. And largely because of early chancellors like Konrad Adenauer and Willy Brandt, you have to see West Germany rehabilitating its reputation. It's an industrial power again, but it's not going to use it for world conquest or attempts to try to suppress its own population. It's trying to become a model citizen for the world that is accepting of its own responsibility for its own past, working to make its people prosperous and free, create a justice system that acted for everyone regardless of race, color, creed, essentially becoming a prosperous, democratic, peaceful state. And they all start seeing what's happening here in Britain. Remember, Clement Attlee had been Prime Minister from 1945 to 1951. Churchill didn't like him, always called Attlee a modest man who had a lot to be modest about. And the British were faced at crossroads. They realized they could, at this point, that the colonial era was ending, and they had all this wealth and power that they could either use that wealth to control all these millions of peoples around the world and want to be under British rule, or they could take care of their own poor and needy at home, take care of their own people. They could only do one or the other. So the British under Attlee decided they're going to take care of people of Britain. So under Attlee, they nationalized the Bank of England. It goes from being a private bank, the most powerful financial institution in England, to being under control of the British government. The National Insurance Act is passed. Basically, it's their version of Social Security, strengthening their pension and workers' compensation system. And you have the National Health Service Act. And these are both in 1946. National Health Service, NHS, it is nationalized health insurance. Basically, everybody in England, they have free medical care. It's paid for through their taxes. So you're not going to have anybody in England ever having to go bankrupt because they can't afford a medical bill or can't afford to go see a doctor. They're sick to go to a doctor to get taken care of. The late 1950s, you have 90% of British doctors participating in the National Health Service. Very popular program in England. So they have a very high, they have an excellent health care system. So they're one of the envies of the world. So a lot of doctors and medical care available. And so there's some complaints about it here and there, but of course, in the system we have some complaints about it. But overall, seen being very successful. All this forced Britain to reduce its expenses abroad, and so it started dismantling the British Empire and reducing military expenditures abroad. It had very heavy debts from the war, and these debts and economic problems continued for decades. For the 1970s, the pound was being steadily devalued, more colonies being abandoned. Churchill was brought back in as a prime minister again from 1951 to 1955. Second time as prime minister. Again, some economic problems faced by the British. Even though these National Insurance Act, National Health Service Act are very popular, the debts and economic problems in the war were weighing down the Attlee government, and it affected the second Churchill administration as well. But nevertheless, after Attlee's thrust out of office in 1951, it's going to be the Conservatives in power in England about 1964. Canada, a lot of economic growth and development between 1945 and 1970. A lot of the financing is coming from the United States, American investments, Canadian firms. But this ended up leading more to Canadian fears of economic domination by the United States. Canada enjoyed a friendly relationship with the United States, but it wanted to be, well, they wanted to remain just friends, let's put it that way. Between 1945 and 1957, you have a lot of liberal governments by the Liberal Party controlling Canada. Between that 1957 and 1960s, you have the Conservative Party in power. They also call them Tories. But you have the Liberals back in power, seesawing back into the 1960s. Now, the government of Lester Pearson was Prime Minister in the late 1960s. See a lot of important changes in Canada. Copying Britain and the United States, Pearson institutes a national social security system and a national health insurance system. Basically, taxpayer financed. Anybody can go anywhere in Canada. Any Canadian citizens can go anywhere in Canada and receive free health care. Again, people don't go bankrupt for medical bills in Canada. Everyone has a doctor in Canada. It's a very successful system. Britain, like Canada, they saw health care as a right. It wasn't a commodity to be traded, bought, or sold. It's, if you're sick, if you're injured, you deserve care. And that's possible. The United States, 1960s, see a move towards civil rights, particularly under John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and for them, Harry Truman, and try to expand social services. And so, under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it came enshrined in American law that everyone would be equal under law, and discrimination would be equal regardless of race, color, creed, sex, nationality. Men and women were both equal. All races were considered equal under law. It took years to try to root out the nagging problems of discrimination and institutional discrimination that was wreaking havoc among American minority groups and weighing them down. Expansion of social services and education programs continue to expand. America maintains its role as a leader economically, industrially, scientifically. It is the United States who is able to put a man on the moon. No other country has ever done that. But throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and the 1970s, this continued preoccupation with the Cold War continued. But it continued to drive so much of its culture and foreign policy.